As a police officer in emergency services, you move towards danger, whereas everyone's automatic reaction would be to run away from it. Have you ever felt unsafe doing the job?
I don't think you do at the time. You probably do afterwards, because something comes over the radio, or you see something happening straight away. Your instinct is to deal with it. The public would expect that to happen as well. And if yes, there's risks within the police, and these are risks that we have to take, and we have to risk assess everything. If something is that dangerous, we might say, well, actually, I'm not going to go over there and deal with it. I've risk assessed that, and I've made a decision, and I've got a rationale that supports the decision I've made. However, I'm still going to be looking to deal with it. Whether that is then, let's say there's someone in a town centre carrying a knife, I might make the decision that I'm not going to rush over and deal with that, but what I am going to do is use my radio to call up for more assistance, call up for officers maybe with taser, with firearms officers, protect other members of the public so we're clearing the space around them. So I'm still dealing with it. If I run away, well, actually, that's the worst thing in the world I can do, and I probably shouldn't be a police officer, and I'd probably be facing some sort of misconduct allegations if I did that anyway.
And do each police force have a firearms section?
Yes, so every police force will have firearms officers. These days, there's more and more firearms officers available, and should the need arise that firearms officers actually need to be deployed, they can be deployed pretty quickly because there are a lot more firearms officers available to sort of choose from these days.
Can I ask, I guess, on that point of firearms, there's such a huge difference between the way that, for example, the US is policed and the way that the UK is policed. And it's partly in the way that it's like manifest, they carry guns, everybody carries guns. But can you explain a bit about the idea of police by consent and what that means for being a police person in England and Wales and the UK?
Well, we use the example of the public is the police and the police are the public. Without the public, the police are nothing. We want to police by consent. So that doesn't mean that we have to get people's consent to do everything. We don't. But if you look at America, sometimes the perception can be that it's shoot first, ask questions later. You look in this country about the occasions when police officers have used deadly force, they've shot people. That's something that's huge, and it will something that often is forgotten about is the impact it has on the officer who actually pulls that trigger. I'm certainly aware of officers who have not pulled a trigger because they've been so concerned about the impact. Yet they've got other injuries dealing with that. They just didn't want to shoot this person. Classic thing, mental health issues. Someone who's got severe mental health issues and can be very quickly and obviously apparent to a police officer, they're not going to want to shoot that person. So it's a huge thing. It has to be justified, and thankfully it's very, very rare in this country when it does happen. And if a police officer shoots someone, and rightly so, it should be fully examined and investigated. But these police officers go through very rigorous training, and the last thing in the world they ever want to do is shoot, but they have to be prepared that if they need to, that they will actually pull that trigger.
Okay, so moving back to our scenario of Kelly, she's entered custody, she's in a police cell now, and you feel the need to interview her. What is the process for you as a police officer interviewing a suspect?
So whenever anyone's arrested and interviewed, they get given their rights. And one of the main fundamental rights is that they're entitled to free and independent legal advice. So the police can't advise people on whether to have a solicitor or not. However, the more serious an offence is, the more someone might want to strongly consider whether they need legal representation. And there are occasions that people don't, for whatever reason that is, and sometimes people will. But when people are actually physically interviewed, let's assume that this person's having a solicitor.
Yes. Yeah,
given that you are a solicitor's company, I would assume that...
Yep, she's having a solicitor.
Excellent. So that person, before the interview, the solicitor would be provided with what we call pre-interview briefing. So they would be provided with circumstances about the leading up to the arrest and why this person is suspected of the offence. And right at the start of the interview, they'd be cautioned. Now, this is something that everyone's probably heard in one form of capacity on the television. It's normally some sort of like traffic cops or something, and someone babbling a load of words really, really quickly. When it comes to the interview, that should be explained in really specific detail, because it's the most important thing that person.
And how would you explain it to a suspect?
So the way I've always done it is I explain that caution as it is in slow terms. I don't rattle it off as quick as I can. I will then break it down. So it's got 3 sections to it. I'll break it down to explain what each section means. And then what I'll do is I'll actually ask questions to the suspect to check that they understand that caution. Now, sometimes suspects might have elected, for whatever reason, to answer no comment. Now, these questions I'll be asking would be purely to check that they understand that caution. Because if they don't, it's my duty to make sure they do understand it in whatever way I can. And then once that's done, then I can move on to asking them questions as part of the investigation about the offence they've been arrested for.
And what do you think about defence solicitors?
It's an interesting. I've worked in training before, and I used to do a scenario where I would ask on an interview course. I would ask students, officers, detectives, say, right, what do we think of defence solicitors? And I'd get a pen and paper, and I'd be writing up there, and you'd have all these words fired at you: corrupt, bent, wasting time, all this sort of stuff. And then I'd flip it and say, what do you think defence solicitors think of us? And at the end of the day, whatever advice or apparent advice a defence solicitor gives, we don't know why that is. Before the interview, as I said, that we'd give the solicitor information about the offence. That solicitor will then meet with their client in a private consultation that the police will not know anything about, other than they are having a talk. During that conversation, anything can be said. The suspect can admit an offence, deny an offence, not even want to talk to the solicitor. The solicitor can offer advice. They can give advice. They can't tell the suspect what to do, and it's up to that suspect what they want to do. But ultimately, they've chosen to have legal advice. Maybe they should listen to the legal advice, because it is advice. So I think with experience, you become quite normalised that defence solicitors, they are doing a job. Now, you might not agree with what they're doing, but you're not privy to the full facts. So I think it's a case of not even worrying about things. Clearly, we will have different agendas. We'll be coming at it from different viewpoints. But as long as everyone's professional about it, there shouldn't be any issues or problems.
Do you have any tricks that you use in interviews to try and get people to talk?
Do you think I'm going to tell you those?
Because I've sat in interviews where police officers ask questions that they clearly know the facts are incorrect. So they'll ask the suspect, oh, you live at this address, and give the wrong address or give the wrong name, to try and get the person to correct the officer and then continue talking.
In my view, it's not about having tricks. The purpose of an interview is to obtain an account. You want that suspect to talk to you. Okay, and if they're going to talk, they're going to talk. And generally, if they're not going to talk, they won't. But I'm sure we've all been in interviews before where we said, no comment, but, and then they start talking anyway. So it's not about having tricks. Yes, I want that person to talk. I want that person to feel comfortable. I'll make that person feel comfortable. But it's not about, let's just try and trick them into it. If they're guilty of an offence, ultimately that's not for me to decide anyway. But if they are responsible for an offence, it's for me to prove it. An interview is part of that investigation. And at the same time, if they are not responsible for an offence, that will come out during the course of the investigation. But I'd like to hope that that person would say, and if they've been accused of something they didn't do, I would like to hope that they would actually be saying, I didn't do it. Now, sometimes they might not want to do that for a number of reasons.
Yeah, so 9 times out of 10 for us, if we sit in a consultation and someone tells us they're guilty of an offence, we would recommend no comment, because our role there is to advise them, to protect their position, and we don't want them to potentially say something that will add to the case the police, the prosecution have against them. And when we go to court, they're going to be pleading guilty anyway, so they get full credit for the early guilty plea.
And I think that's the thing, that there's a lot of police officers will understand, but there's also a lot of police officers that don't, almost saying, well, why are they not talking? Why are they not admitting it? The evidence is overwhelming. Well, maybe they're not admitting it because the evidence is overwhelming. The difficulty that some police officers will meet is that, depending on the circumstances, it can mean more admin and paperwork.
And that paperwork, has that increased over your time as a police officer?
Massively. It's no secret. It's huge. Especially, when I first joined, we were handwriting stuff, then we were typing stuff. Now everything's being, then stuff was sent on email. Now it's being sent digitally. Disclosure is a huge thing across the country, and anything that reduces admin, police officers will want to do, and anything that increases admin will just cause more hassle and headaches.
So for this scenario, you would have had to write a statement for pulling her over in the car.
Yep.
For the arrest.
Yeah.
You'd then have to draft a disclosure document.
Yeah.
Type up the interview summary in terms of a statement, and then produce a pack of evidence for the prosecution.
Correct.
And what does that pack of evidence consist of?
Without going into sort of different forms, etc., but every bit of material that is relevant to the investigation. So anything that can have an impact on that investigation that concerns the offence that's being investigated, the suspect that's being investigated, or the surrounding circumstances. So this can include body-worn video, accounts from other police officers, forensic evidence from the lab about in this example, about what the drugs are. If we are looking at fingerprints or DNA evidence as well, evidence from that. All of the sort of the notes that go behind all of this as well. And then it's all got to be typed up. It's all got to be sent digitally. It takes time. And this is time that, of course, is on top of the officer's day-to-day stuff, especially if it's a response officer. They might be dealing with this on the one day. And the next day they come back on duty and they've still got all this admin to do, but actually their radio's going and they've got to go to all these incidents of 999 calls, and they've got to fit all this stuff in on top of that.
Yeah, 'cause it's well publicised about cuts to budgets, and the number of police have been reduced, and the police officers that are there now are being overworked. The bail conditions or changed in 2017, so people now aren't released on bail as often and released under investigation. So officers, I'm sure, have more and more cases now to deal with. Is that putting a lot more pressure on individual police officers?
I think that's fairly. You don't need any specific stats, but you can see that in just everything that's reported within social media, within the news nationally. It's no secret that numerous thousands of police officers were cut. Yes, the government are saying they're bringing back more, but actually it's not just the numbers. It's not just the bums on seats, so to speak. It's all that experience as well. Yeah. So we're getting in more and more new officers, which is great, but these new officers haven't got the experience as yet, and they're still developing that. On top of, with all of the way that cases are managed these days, there's so much more digital, technological evidence to gather, so it takes longer to investigate crimes. So caseloads can pick up, and when you're dealing with an increased workload with less experience, it's not great. It's not a great scenario.
How have you had to adapt over COVID?
A lot of that was done. We changed to doing a lot of things remotely. So rather than going out to people's houses and taking statements, we would look to take statements over the phone, via email, doing it using technology a bit more. The likes of Teams and Zoom, they've probably, if you bought shares in that just before lockdown, blimey, you'd be rich, wouldn't you? But, so meetings that can be done like that. It's about trying to adapt your ways, but ultimately the work hasn't changed. And in fact, it hasn't really reduced. I think right at the start of lockdown, when there were no one was going out, yes, for that 1 or 2 months or so, but then everything changed. Crime types were changing. You got more online crimes that are going on. So police officers are still just as busy as ever.
Do you have more pressure now? Because during lockdown at the start, I know the magistrates' courts went from dealing between 9 and 10,000 trials a month down to 176 for a couple of months. Some offences, there's a 6-month time limit from commission of the offence to laying the information in court. And we saw after the lockdown, lots of cases were coming through that clearly hadn't been prepared as well as normal by the police, by the prosecution. As a police force, were you feeling pressured to try and push cases through to ensure that the time limit didn't expire?
No more so than usual, I'd say. Only recently I've just dealt with a case that unfortunately that happened, that we ran out of time and we didn't get that. And that's frustrating. It's frustrating for the officers because officers don't do it deliberately. It's also frustrating to cases where you've got victims attached because the victims aren't getting any form of justice. And I would imagine that when you sort of take take a step back and look at actually from the suspect's point of view, that they've been investigated for 6 months and then there's no real resolution about that. And it's very difficult because they might just say, well, okay, that's the end of the matter. But maybe, for example, if they'd said, well, I was not guilty, of course they haven't been found not guilty. We've just run out of time and we can't proceed with the case. So from their point of view, they've kind of got that hanging over their head.